strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi, and on the gist today, we're looking at the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the latest on those developments and news on and around Ukraine. Our expert analyst today is Detsch, who joins us from Washington, D.C. early there morning. He's the national security and Pentagon reporter for the foreign policy. Hi, Jack. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Amitabh.
Lots of developments in Ukraine and around Ukraine, about Ukraine. I want to kick off straight away by looking at what happened with the intelligence officials at the House Select Committee on Intelligence hearing yesterday. Just going to play out what the Director of National Intelligence said in terms of the intelligence assessment looking into Vladimir Putin's head, the U.S. intelligence assessment.
Putin probably anticipated many of the current sanctions to be imposed when he weighed the cost of the invasion. We judged that he did not anticipate either the degree to which the United States and its allies and partners would take steps to undermine his capacity to mitigate Western actions, or the pullback from Russia initiated by non-state actors in the private sector. And nevertheless, our analysts assess that Putin is unlikely to be deterred by such setbacks and instead may escalate, essentially doubling down to achieve Ukrainian disarmament and neutrality to prevent it from further integrating with the U.S. and NATO if it doesn't reach some diplomatic negotiation. We assess Putin feels aggrieved the West does not give him proper deference and perceives this as a war he cannot afford to lose.
A war that he cannot afford to lose, I beg your pardon. Jack, I mean, we've seen the intelligence assessments coming out of Washington now for months.
Right.
That's not a good sign of what's coming ahead.
No, I mean, Amitabh, it sort of looks like Putin is doubling down on a Syria-like strategy that may not be necessarily targeting civilians, but certainly we're seeing civilians in the crossfire now, in the shelling that he's done on cities like Kharkiv, Ukraine's second biggest, just scenes of disaster from that city, similar to what we saw from Aleppo in Syria in recent years. But it's very clear at this moment, the Russians don't see room to back down. Any de-escalatory off-ramps they've put on the table have basically been brushed aside by the Ukrainians and the West. It seems like they're floating an olive branch with this notion of neutrality, quote unquote, but it's just not clear what status quo they're hoping to achieve, what the end game is, and that's what intelligence officials and experts are really grasping at here.
Intelligence officials have been talking, as I said, now for months, both on camera, on record, off record. Right. Give us the big picture on that. Now, on one hand, it's transparent, it's coming out. It was to hope to deter Putin's invasion, which didn't happen. On the other side, there is an information war that is also going on.
That's right, Amitabh. And I think there was just a lot of resignation in Washington and other Western capitals going back to November, December, when it began to look ominous, when we saw the intelligence assessments that Putin could put up to 200,000 troops in the field, which he has now, of course, done. Just a lot of pessimism because, of course, the U.S. is still focused on its Pacific pivot that we've talked quite a bit about in the past. Focused on deterring China, and this is not a military problem for the West. So the drumbeat of intelligence leaks had sort of two impacts. I mean, one, to sort of call out Russia, call Russia's bluff, and we saw that particularly in the last few months to war, when Putin was getting close to recognizing the breakaway provinces in Ukraine. The U.S. really tried to foil any pretext for war to make it more politically costly for Putin. So that was one piece of it. The other piece of it is to steel the West for what Avril Haines was describing at the top of the program, the clip that you played, for a much more resolved Western response. We certainly didn't think in the days before the invasion we would see Western sanctions on the level of the SWIFT banking system. That seemed to be off the table. Suddenly it came back on the table. The sanctions on the Russian central bank are incredibly stiff and prevent Putin from basically stashing his reserves elsewhere to mitigate the effect of sanctions. So these are very, very strong and crippling sanctions. The question is just going to be, will American consumers and Western consumers live with higher prices at the pump and economic blowback that we're certainly going to see from this?
Yeah, I mean, what is it? $4 a gallon now? I mean, it hasn't been that high for years.
Yeah, no, it's not going to come down, and that's going to be a question of political cost, certainly for President Biden as he's looking towards 2022 and 2024. Certainly, Republican gains expected. The opposition party here in the U.S. In the House of Representatives, the lower chamber, if not the Senate, that could certainly hamstring Biden's agenda. So they're going to be looking for whatever they can do. Western officials I was speaking to yesterday, looking at the North Sea as a potential option for energy, speaking to Gulf partners about new energy routes, but it's hard to get something online on the level of a Russia. The U.S. and the U.K., which blocked the exports, don't import a lot of Russian oil, but certainly it's just hard to get the rest of Europe off of Russian oil and natural gas in long term.
You talked about the swift and severe sanctions, economic sanctions.
Mm-hmm.
Arms are also being funneled into Ukraine from various countries, not just the U.S. Though there are two things that President Biden has made clear: no boots on the ground in Ukraine for NATO and the U.S., and the no-fly zone has been scotched, right?
That's right, Amitabh. I mean, to impose a no-fly zone, you're basically asking the U.S. And effectively the NATO alliance to potentially declare war here. You'd be talking about knocking Russian planes out of the sky, taking out whatever air defenses they have on the ground, those S-300 and S-400 batteries that, of course, India has been looking to take into its own arsenal. So that would easily be seen as an escalatory step with a nuclear power, and that's really been a no-go for the West. On the question of arms, it seems like it's going to be business as usual in terms of funneling in those Javelin anti-tank missiles, which have been going in for the past year. The update, of course, has been the Stinger missiles coming in the past month. Those are very effective systems which can take out Russian helicopters, and certainly we've seen much less Russian aviation playing a factor on the battlefield than we expected. So there may be some deterrent effect there. The question's going to be just maybe not with no fly zone, but the Ukrainians have really desired upgraded air defenses. They've been pushing the Western allies for it for months now. Those calls have intensified with the pressure being wrenched up on Kyiv in the coming days. So that's something we can expect. It's still hard to see how the West would provide those.
Talking about, you were talking about gas prices, and viewer Harshal Gore has a question. Will we see POTUS lifting sanctions on Venezuelan oil?
It's an interesting question. The administration here in Washington has been talking to the Venezuelans, seemingly in an effort to bring them in from the cold and to try and distance them from the Russians. It's a possibility, but it would just be very difficult for Biden because he just has many forces within his own party and with Republicans who are very much focused on the maximum pressure type approach that we've seen on Venezuela, maximal American sanctions, pushing for regime change. So normalizing the Venezuelan regime when they don't bring much to the table in terms of an Iran nuclear deal, for instance, would be difficult to do.
There's another one for you, Jack. Jaideep Gadavi, who says, good morning. Great to have Jack here. I really appreciate his work. And there's a question for you. Do you think the intelligence community in the U.S. and West in general has restored its credibility with regards to the Russian invasion after a not so good record in Iraq and Afghanistan?
Well, I mean, I think assessing the record of the intelligence community is so hard to do since a lot is under wraps. Certainly, this is just a new playbook that we've seen from Washington and the intelligence community. The rapid declassification of intelligence, passing it on to new allies, And I think this is going to be something that we're going to see in the future, that the U.S. has thought a lot about, right? To pass new intelligence to partners like India, which is not a treaty ally, which operates on much different systems, but that the U.S. wants to integrate in when you have, of course, challenges on the border with China, of course, the major U.S. adversary. So it's kind of a question of looking what you can declassify to sort of name and shame rivals on the international scene, and also to basically expand the intelligence networks, which typically have been so constrained to alliances like the Five Eyes network, just a handful of Western partners. So that's what I expect to see, just a much more rapid declassification of intelligence going forward. And it's easier to do now too, because there's satellites up in the sky that are private satellites. So the U.S. government can basically just latch its analysis onto things that are already in the public sector.
And right. One of the assessments that came out at the House Select Committee on the Ukrainian Air Force was that its major part of it is still functioning. I mean, and they have it in control in that sense. The Russians haven't destroyed that. But could you explain to us this yes, no, denials about Poland and
Yes.
the MiG-29s in the backfill that they have requested or not requested?
Well, the U.S. and the Poles have been deep in negotiations about these, nearly 30 MiG-29 Soviet-era fighter jets that would potentially be coming to Ukraine. The problem is logistical, right? Because you don't want to be in a position of escalating the conflict, and this has always been Biden's issue here, that they don't want to be seen as a party to the conflict by providing these, by having Americans or these planes coming off of NATO soil. So this makes it a little bit more challenging. If the Ukrainians were even to go and pick them up in Germany, the optics there could lead the Russians to then say the U.S. and the NATO allies are now a party to the conflict. So that would be just a really difficult sell. And it certainly seems like there's a lot of heartburn in the Pentagon and other agencies about doing it that way. I think there is interest in providing these types of aircraft. The question is just on what timeline and how could you do it without escalating the conflict?
Well, in terms of the Russia-China relationship and what's happening in terms of confrontation with the U.S. and China and the rest of the world, just again want to go back to that House Select Committee and listen into a soundbite from the CIA Director William Burns when he was asked about the assessment of how China was looking at the whole situation in Ukraine.
That relationship, the partnership between Russia and China has strengthened since 2019. I would add, though, that I think the President Xi and the Chinese leadership are a little bit unsettled by what they're seeing in Ukraine. They did not anticipate the significant difficulties the Russians were going to run into. I think they're unsettled by the reputational damage that can come by their close association with President Putin. Second, by the economic consequences at a moment when they're facing lower annual growth rates than they've experienced for more than 3 decades. I think they're a little bit unsettled about the impact on the global economy. And third, I think they're a little bit unsettled by the way in which Vladimir Putin has driven Europeans and Americans much closer together. I think they've valued their relationship with Europe and valued what they believe to be their capacity to try to drive wedges between us and the Europeans. And so I think that's unsettling for them as well.
Jack, your understanding of Russia being pushed more into China's corner, and can the U.S. have a two-front confrontation? I mean, the focus is shifting away from the Indo-Pacific and China's aggression.
Right, and that's the challenge, Amitabh, because the administration has wanted to keep the eye on the ball and basically still hone in on China. I expect that to be the focus, right? But they're revising the national security strategy, Biden's foreign policy blueprint, which was almost off the shelf and ready to be rolled out before Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine. Now that has to be revised to sort of a new world order. But the same issue still holds. As you mentioned, I think very astutely, the U.S. isn't in the business anymore of fighting two-front conflicts. For years, it was the Pentagon's military doctrine that you could sort of toggle back and forth between 2 major wars and then a smaller theater war. The U.S. just doesn't have the military bandwidth for that anymore, and they've laid that out very clearly in the 2017 National Defense Strategy. So I think, again, what we're going to continue to see is the military focusing its efforts on a China conflict. But the question is just going to be, can you walk and chew gum, as the Washington phrase goes, potentially putting more troops into NATO zones to reassure the allies, while simultaneously preparing for, what everyone expects in a few years to be much more ramped up pressure on Taiwan from the Chinese.
So walk and chew gum at the same time, and possibly hold two sticks too while you're doing that. But does the U.S. understand India's position? I mean, we've seen what the statements that have come out in the United Nations Security Council, General Assembly, the abstentions there, that because of the legacy relationship with Russia and such a dependence on military hardware for the conflict against China, that India's position, is it understood and taken? How is it taken in Washington?
Yeah, I mean, I think for a few years now, right, as the U.S. has tried to basically lure India out of its strategic crouch, sort of the years of non-aligned posture, and to a more aggressive footing towards China, they've realized some of the limitations. Just as you mentioned, I mean, the enormous amount of Soviet and Russian material that's still in Indian arsenals. The S-400 seems like it will still go forward, and the U.S. is not going to crack down on India in the same way it cracked down on Turkey for that, with severe sanctions. Would be my guess, and certainly there's been push in the U.S. Congress against that. Yeah, I think the U.S. long term would like to have a conversation with India about how to wean themselves off of those systems. It's just, obviously a very difficult sell, and U.S. officials still are concerned about what's going on in the border regions on the Himalayas, with the Chinese sort of ramping up and ramping down that pressure, something you, of course, follow very closely, Amitabh. So it's not like you can basically change horses in midstream, or, walk and chew gum there, whatever metaphor you want to use. There are certain limitations to basically just disposing of a Russian arsenal at this point, when you face such problems on the border.
And there's even higher technology, cutting edge technology than the S-400s when you talk about the SSNs and the Lees from the Russians as well. Would probably attract CAATSA as well, possibly a CAATSA waiver on how is that something that is talked about in Washington?
I think the focus has been on the S-400 mostly, just that system. I think people understand the degree to which you need to upgrade old equipment. The question is just more the big major billion-dollar purchases of new Russian equipment that basically turn up eyebrows in Washington and don't square with the American letter of the law since 2017.
There have been a lot of nuclear concerns. Vladimir Putin had a meeting of a strategic command. The nuclear alert was raised. Chernobyl was attacked. There have been reports of other nuclear stations as well. Also, concerns, claims, counterclaims on U.S. bioresearch. Russia accusing the U.S. of, working with pathogens or biological weapons in Ukraine. What's your reading of all of that?
Well, I mean, I think, it's not unusual for, nuclear saber rattling to be going on. And certainly, I think, people are concerned, of course, because where Putin has been, quote unquote, psychologically, I think the Americans are trying to establish a profile of where Putin really is, because the rhetoric that's come out of the Kremlin in the past few weeks, this denazification language that Putin used to justify his invasion of Ukraine after sort of all the pretexts were fumbled through, is something that's really turned up a lot of eyebrows in Washington. And you pair that with higher alert status of the nuclear forces, it's something that certainly causes worries and a lot of heartburn. And that's, of course, goes back to what we were talking about, Amitabh, with the escalation fears. I think the U.S. is just worried about potentially this conflict expanding. They want to make sure that you can sort of bottle it up, force the Russians to get to the table, force them to de-escalate as quickly as possible, and make sure that other NATO allies aren't in the crosshairs, especially from those Russian nuclear forces.
Going to take some more viewer questions. This is Kurt Cobain. I think that's an inspiration from Nirvana. What does the future look like for the U.S.-Russia relationship, even if President Putin were to take up President Zelensky's offer about talks, a compromise on the Donbas region?
Well, I think you know, the window of discussion has really shifted on Russia in recent months. It's very hard to see how the Russians will be normalized in the way they were normalized after the 2014 conflict, which saw Russian forces go into the Donbas region. You know, I mean, that's something that could be on the table. It's hard to see the Ukrainians compromising on that, even though it's sort of been floated as a potential bargaining chip here. And certainly it still seems like, from everyone we've talked to in the West, American officials, the objective from Putin is still to encircle the city of Kyiv and force the government to fall. Who he brings in as a client state is still an open question. But it doesn't seem like the Donbas is really a viable off-ramp at this point. We'll see, again, if Russian forces continue to be sort of chewed up on this advance, if that forces some domestic pressure on Putin at home to pursue peace.
So another question which has more to do with India's defense procurement and the impact of sanctions, which you have talked about. But if you want to look at the larger issue, Harshal says, with the sanctions on Russia, the import of microchips for defense and other sectors will be affected in Russia. It'll impact arms manufacture. How will this impact India's defense procurement? If you have something to say on that particular question or the larger question.
No, that's a good question. I mean, so one of the things that came out of this sanctions package, and a rather unprecedented step, was, as your viewer mentioned, the sanctions on microchips, basically extending these export controls into basically a form of a sanction. And the U.S. slapped them in place. The Europeans slapped them in place. And in an interesting step, the Japanese and Asian allies also put them in place. So, you know, it's going to be much harder for the Russian arms industry to operate under those conditions, because they, you know, as mentioned, rely on these secondary chips and sources. But certainly this is going to be what the pressure is going to look like on India from the West, to sort of begin to think about kind of turning the ship when it comes to defense procurement a little bit more towards the West and those Western systems. But it's just going to be a long-term haul, and still something I think that's very much in the nascent stages.
And it's not just towards Western systems. India's trying to look inward, is Atmanirbhar Bharat for Make in India as well. But on a separate note, Jack, here is Dinesh Kumar, who says, how much will all of this impact the Iran nuclear deal?
So from what we've heard, the Iran nuclear deal is still kind of in its concluding stages. The Russians are still arguing a little bit with the West on trade carve-outs, just what that will look like with the Iranians. But it seems like it's pretty close to being done. And interestingly, that's one area of American diplomacy with Russia that hasn't been impacted. When Russia basically kicked off this conflict, the U.S. sent out a bunch of diplomatic restrictions on what they can do with the Russians that pretty much affects almost everything except a few issues like the JCPOA. But that certainly seems like it could be a done deal in the next few days.
Now, we've seen that Putin and the Russians have probably gamed everything. They were preparing not just for months, but possibly years. But do you see any going back to 1962 and the Cuban Missile Crisis? I mean, Jorge Picardo says latest news is Putin is threatening to place missiles in Cuba if Ukraine manages to remain independent from Russia. I'm not so sure about that, but do you visualize it going that far as well?
I mean, it's difficult to see sort of the forward deployment of something that far into the Western Hemisphere. I think the interesting thing has been, right, the use of Belarus, of course, which saw a major protest last year against Lukashenko, the pro-Putin president there. That's going to be just an interesting development, the stationing of Russian exercises, nuclear exercises there. The stationing of S-400 batteries that have been rolled into Ukraine, and hundreds of thousands of troops. So, you know, just what role Belarus and other countries play, as well as, you know, if Russia tries to stoke destabilization in the Baltic Sea, in Georgia, in those provinces. They've basically tried to help break away there too. Just a lot of questions about sort of how Russia could cause instability all over the map, essentially.
You mentioned it earlier, but Meghdut Bakale has this question. Do you think Russia getting away with Ukraine will encourage China to think they can also get away with Taiwan?
It's a fascinating question because it's something that the U.S. has thought quite a lot about, and actually Secretary of State Antony Blinken has been thinking a lot about basically what the lessons learned would be for a Taiwan conflict. I think there are a lot of questions basically around the timing, the accuracy of American intelligence systems to spot a buildup. It might not be, just wide out in the open in the same way that we saw the Russians basically ramping up and ramping down pressure on Ukraine for months. So the Chinese may try to do it a little bit faster. And the Chinese also seem like, just militarily, they're a little bit of a ways away, right? You have to cross the Taiwan Strait. That might not be something you could do with paratroopers going right into Taiwanese air defenses. So it's a little bit of a tricky military problem for the Chinese. And now I guess they're aware that you could sort of face this quote unquote pariah status. Now, how long you can isolate economies like Russia and China to be determined. But certainly this is basically the opprobrium that Washington would try to bring down on China. The precedent has been set for if there were invasion of Taiwan.
Harshal Gore has another one, Jack. Very recently, the Ukrainian president declared he is not interested in joining NATO anymore. I'm not so sure he was categorically on that front. Is this a ruse to buy some time for Ukraine, or is he serious?
I mean, that's something that could be on the table, right? We've seen the contours of what could be a deal in the future. I'm very hesitant, to say that they're going to hammer out a diplomatic deal, and these haven't really been the highest level talks, right? These are subordinates in the foreign ministries of Russia and Ukraine. But certainly, what the Russians have talked about is neutrality for the Ukrainians. Certainly that would mean, no NATO membership. I don't think the Ukrainians would want to rule it out. But you still have like a lot of heartburn in the alliance over potentially inviting the Ukrainians in the first place. So I think it's just an open question about what status the Ukrainians will have after this conflict. But it's hard to see the Ukrainian public, which is now decisively turned against Russia in the wake of this invasion, really going for neutrality or not being able to join with the EU, NATO, or Western alliances after this.
We, of course, know about the Russian invasion. We know that Ukraine is not a member of NATO, but there are some who analyze or comment on the fact that America pushed this situation to happen.
Yeah, the NATO expansion in the 1990s.
Yeah, I mean, from then onwards, yeah. And the promises that not an inch more towards the West.
It's interesting because, I think there has been a lot of discussion in Washington in recent months just about whether the U.S. got it right or got it wrong. Did they sort of set the wrong expectations for Yeltsin in the 1990s? It's a little bit difficult to go back in this time and figure that out entirely. With where things stand now, I think there might be a little bit more trepidation in basically further extending those invites, those soft invites that were given to the Georgians and the Ukrainians in 2008, which helped spark the 2008 Russia-Georgia conflict, Putin's invasion there. But I don't think the train is slowing down on NATO expansion. Quite the opposite. I think countries that have been on the periphery of NATO, like Finland and Sweden, are showing a lot more interest in the alliance now with Putin's saber rattling. So I think we could see further expansion, maybe limited expansion. But it certainly seems like people are not going to revise the history books coming out of this one.
And again, I think we'll end with the focus on China and whether that's being lost in all of this, and especially if it gets further dragged on. Just another question or comment, then China's use of AI robots to fight need to be sanctioned. But the overall picture, I mean, I know there was a quad in the middle of all this, a virtual, but your comments on that? to wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, I think just going back to what we talked about, Amitabh, the West is trying to show what the response would be to China in a military scenario, that they would face economic isolation, international isolation, and I think China still wants to boost up its reputation, still look like a benevolent power, and China is, as the CIA director mentioned, facing serious slowdowns to its economic growth. So the strategy would basically be one in the same, of trying to economically isolate China, trying to put pressure on the Chinese public to say to their regime, hey, no more of this.
I'll end with a comment from a viewer, Harshal Gore. Thank you very much for answering the questions and for a very informative discussion. He thanks you, Jack, as do all other viewers, and StratNews Global. Thanks for your time again.
Thanks so much for having me, Amitabh.
The pleasure is ours. And as Omkar points out, we are close to 100,000 subscribers on YouTube. Congratulations in advance. You can help us get there sooner. And also, I'm going to put up a link if you would like to support us, because many have been asking for a UPI payment ID to contribute and support. And that's the link. It's also there in the YouTube descriptor. You've been watching The Gist on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.